For 4 years, the German army seemed unbreakable. Then came August 1918, the 100 Days Offensive, how the Allies finally broke the German army. What happened next would shock everyone. Even the generals didn't see it coming. This is the story of the moment everything changed. Subscribe for more untold World War I stories. For 4 years, the Western Front had been a graveyard of stalemate. Millions died in trenches that barely shifted. Then, in August of 1918, everything changed. In just 95 days, what history would call the 100 Days Offensive, the Allies advanced 100 miles, shattered the German army, and ended the Great War. Yet this campaign remains strangely forgotten, overshadowed by the Somme and Verdun. What makes this period extraordinary is not merely its speed, but how it was achieved. This was the birth of modern combined arms warfare. Tanks no longer attacked alone. Artillery barrages crept forward in precise coordination with infantry advances. Aircraft provided reconnaissance and support. At Amiens, France, on the 8th of August, the British launched an assault so devastating that German commander Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German Army. Soldiers who had endured 4 years of grinding horror suddenly found themselves in a war of movement again. But the offensive was far more than brilliant tactics. It represented the convergence of industrial capacity, technological innovation, and hard-won experience. American reinforcements arrived in staggering numbers. Fresh Canadian and Australian forces drove deep into German positions. The French attacked along the Oise River. The Germans, exhausted and depleted, could not stop the tide. This is the story of how the deadlocked Western Front finally broke, how tactical genius and overwhelming force combined to transform warfare forever, and why this pivotal moment in military history has been largely written out of our collective memory. By the summer of 1918, the Western Front had become something worse than a graveyard. It was a monument to futility. For 4 years, generals on both sides had hurled millions of men at fortified positions, watching them die in waves that barely moved the front lines. The Somme in 1916, Verdun, Passchendaele, each battle promised breakthrough, each delivered only casualties. The statistics had become almost incomprehensible. Hundreds of thousands dead for gains measured in miles, sometimes in yards. Yet beneath this surface of apparent stagnation, something fundamental was shifting. The war itself was transforming, though few recognized it at the time. The technological innovations that would finally shatter the deadlock were already being tested, refined, and integrated into new doctrines of warfare. What had begun as desperate experiments in 1916 and 17 were hardening into systematic approaches by 1918. The old ways of fighting were dying, though the armies had not yet fully grasped what would replace them. The British in particular had been studying their failures. After the catastrophic losses of the Somme, where nearly 60,000 British soldiers fell on a single day, military theorists began questioning the fundamental assumptions that had governed trench warfare. Could artillery barrages alone break through defensive positions? The evidence suggested not. Could massed infantry assaults succeed against machine guns and barbed wire? History was writing a grim answer. What was needed was something different. Something that could combine firepower, mobility, and coordination in ways the trenches had never before witnessed. The answer lay partly in machines that had first appeared on the Somme but had never been properly exploited. Tanks. The British had introduced them in 1916 with great hope and mixed results. They were slow, mechanically unreliable, and commanders had not yet learned how to use them effectively. But by 1918, the lessons were accumulating. Tanks could cross trenches, they could resist machine gun fire, they could suppress enemy positions while infantry advanced. The question was not whether tanks were useful, but how to employ them in sufficient numbers with proper coordination to achieve real strategic effects. Equally important was the evolution of artillery tactics. The creeping barrage represented a revolutionary concept. Instead of a massive bombardment followed by infantry attack, artillery would advance in a carefully calculated pattern, lifting and moving forward in stages as infantry advanced behind it. This required unprecedented coordination between artillery officers and infantry commanders, synchronized watches, and clear communication. The technique had been tested piecemeal, but no one had yet attempted it on a truly massive scale. Then there was the air war. Aircraft had evolved from fragile reconnaissance platforms into fighters and bombers with genuine destructive capability. By 1918, the Allies were beginning to understand that air superiority mattered. If they could control the skies above a battlefield, they could observe enemy movements, prevent enemy reconnaissance, and provide close support to ground forces. The German Air Force, once dominant, had been steadily worn down through attrition and fuel shortages. The Allies had begun to achieve something approaching air superiority in certain sectors. Meanwhile, the German situation was deteriorating in ways that few on the Western Front could fully appreciate. The spring offensive of 1918, Germany's massive gamble to achieve victory before American forces arrived in overwhelming numbers, had failed. It had also exhausted German reserves of men and material. The German army had not broken, but it had been bled white. The soldiers themselves were increasingly demoralized. The home front was fracturing under the strain of blockade and privation. German newspapers spoke of revolution, of political upheaval. The military leadership knew, though they could not publicly admit it, that time was running out. This was the crucible from which the 100 Days Offensive would emerge. It was not conceived as a grand, unified campaign stretching across 3 months and multiple nations. Rather, it began as a series of opportunistic attacks designed to exploit German weakness and test new tactical combinations. The British command under Field Marshal Douglas Haig, often criticized for his rigid thinking, had actually become more flexible and experimental by 1918. French commanders under General Ferdinand Foch, now coordinating all Allied operations, shared this willingness to innovate. The geographical setting for what was about to unfold stretched across northern France and into Belgium, terrain that had been carved and scarred by 4 years of warfare. Near the town of Amiens, approximately 49.895 degrees north and 2.3022 degrees east, the landscape bore the wounds of countless battles. Villages had been reduced to rubble, farmland had been transformed into a lunar surface of craters and trenches. The Hindenburg Line, the Germans' most formidable defensive position, stretched across the landscape like a scar. It was particularly strong near the St. Quentin Canal, at coordinates approximately 49.9170 degrees north and 3.2500 degrees east. This was the terrain where the new warfare would be tested. This was where tanks and aircraft, creeping barrages and coordinated infantry would finally be brought together in sufficient numbers and with sufficient coordination to achieve something the Western Front had not yet seen: genuine breakthrough and exploitation. The ground itself would tell the story. Archaeologists working with teams from the University of Amiens, using ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR technology decades later, would uncover trench networks and debris fields that revealed the scale and intensity of what was about to occur. Shell casings, personal effects, and the physical evidence of battle would speak to the human reality behind the statistics. But in August of 1918, as the Allies prepared their opening moves, the full significance of what was about to happen remained obscured. Soldiers and officers knew they were preparing something different, something potentially important. They did not fully understand that they were about to participate in the campaign that would finally break the German army and end the war. They did not know that history would call it the 100 Days Offensive, though in fact it would last 95 days. They did not grasp that they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of warfare, one in which combined arms coordination would replace the futile mass assaults of earlier years. What they did know was that they were tired. They had been fighting for 4 years, they had seen friends and comrades fall, they had watched offensives fail and positions remain unchanged. Now they were being told to prepare for something new, something that required new skills and new ways of thinking about battle. The machines were arriving, the orders were being distributed, the coordination was being practiced, all the pieces were being positioned for a transformation that would finally break the deadlock of the Western Front and bring an end to the war that had consumed a generation. On the morning of August 8, 1918, the earth itself seemed to awaken to war. Along a 20-mile front near the city of Amiens in northern France, something unprecedented was about to unfold. British General Edmund Allenby had orchestrated what would become known as the Battle of Amiens, and with it the opening salvo of the 100 Days Offensive. This was not merely another battle in an endless succession of futile assaults. This was the moment when the Western Front would finally, decisively, begin to break. The conditions that morning were perfect for what the planners had envisioned. A heavy fog rolled across the devastated landscape, obscuring the British preparations from German observation posts. The weather that favored surprise would prove crucial to what was about to happen. In the mist and darkness, over 600 tanks moved into position, their metal hulls grinding across scarred earth. Behind them, artillery pieces numbering in the thousands stood ready, and overhead, aircraft of the Royal Flying Corps prepared for coordinated strikes that would represent a revolutionary approach to warfare. The tactical innovations that the Allies had developed represented nothing less than a new form of combat. The creeping barrage, perfected through years of experimentation and failure, would advance ahead of the infantry in a precisely timed wall of shell fire. This was not the old method of preliminary bombardment followed by infantry assault. This was continuous fire that moved forward at a walking pace, pinning German defenders in their trenches, while Allied soldiers advanced directly behind it. Coordinated with this barrage would be tanks, which had proven their value at the Somme and Passchendaele, but never before in such coordinated fashion. And providing overhead support would be aircraft, strafing German positions, and conducting reconnaissance missions that would give the Allies unprecedented visibility into enemy movements. The German High Command had grown complacent. Despite the warnings from field commanders about the concentration of British forces, the German army had never fully grasped the implications of what was being assembled. General Ludendorff, the driving force behind German military strategy, believed the German line could absorb any assault. He had been proven wrong before, but never had he faced an offensive coordinated with such precision and technological sophistication. When the barrage opened at 4:30 in the morning, the sound was apocalyptic. Thousands of guns spoke simultaneously, and the earth convulsed beneath the impact of tens of thousands of shells. The Canadian Corps, positioned at the northern sector of the offensive, surged forward with their British counterparts. Australian and New Zealand forces pushed from the south. The fog that had provided concealment during the approach now became a weapon, disorienting German defenders who could not see the masses of soldiers and machines advancing toward them through the murk. The tanks proved devastatingly effective in ways that previous tank deployments had not. The Whippet tanks, faster and more maneuverable than their predecessors, raced ahead of the infantry, their machine guns suppressing German defensive positions. Mark IV tanks, heavier and more heavily armored, provided sustained firepower support. Working in concert with the creeping barrage and infantry, they achieved what had eluded commanders for 4 years: breakthrough. The German front line, which had seemed immovable for so long, began to collapse. By the end of the first day, the Allies had advanced over 7 miles in some sectors. This single day of advance represented more ground gain than entire campaigns of the previous years had achieved. German prisoners streamed backward by the thousands, many of them bewildered by the speed of the Allied advance and the apparent invulnerability of the tanks that pursued them. The German response was chaotic and ineffective. Ludendorff himself would later call August 8th the Black Day of the German army, a phrase that would echo through history as the moment the Central Powers' fate was sealed. German reserves were rushed to the breakthrough sector, but they arrived piecemeal and were fed into the battle without adequate coordination. The German army, which had prided itself on tactical flexibility and rapid response, found itself unable to respond effectively to this new form of warfare. What made the Battle of Amiens truly revolutionary was not merely the technology employed, but the integration of that technology with infantry tactics and artillery coordination. This was the birth of what military theorists would later call combined arms warfare. The aircraft provided reconnaissance that allowed commanders to see the developing battle in near real time. The artillery barrage protected the advancing infantry from machine gun fire, the tanks broke through wire and fortifications, and the infantry, following closely behind the barrage, overwhelmed positions that had been softened by the preliminary bombardment. The human cost, while dramatically lower than in previous offensives, remained staggering. British forces suffered approximately 9,000 casualties on the first day. Canadian forces, positioned in the northern sector where the breakthrough was most complete, suffered over 3,000 casualties. German losses, including prisoners of war, numbered in the tens of thousands. But the crucial difference was the strategic result. For the first time in 4 years, an Allied offensive had achieved genuine operational success. The Battle of Amiens lasted from August 8th through August 12th, 1918. In those 5 days, the Allies captured over 27,000 German prisoners and destroyed or captured nearly 400 German artillery pieces. More importantly, they shattered German confidence in their ability to hold the line. The myth of German military invulnerability, carefully cultivated since the beginning of the war, lay broken across the fields near Amiens. But this was only the beginning. The British High Command, sensing that the German army was now vulnerable in ways it had never been before, pressed forward. Rather than allow the Germans time to reorganize and establish new defensive positions, the Allies launched a series of successive offensives along the entire Western Front. The Third Army attacked near Albert. The French First Army advanced in the south. The American Expeditionary Forces, still relatively new to major offensive operations, attacked in the Meuse-Argonne sector. The Hindenburg Line, that supposedly impregnable fortification that the Germans had retreated to in 1917, now became the focus of intense fighting. This massive system of trenches, barbed wire, and fortifications had been constructed over months and had never been successfully breached. German soldiers had been trained specifically to defend it. Yet, in late September 1918, British, Canadian, and Australian forces attacked it near the St. Quentin Canal. Using the same combined arms tactics that had succeeded at Amiens, they broke through. The Hindenburg Line, which had seemed to promise indefinite German resistance, fell in a matter of days. The psychological impact of these successive breakthroughs cannot be overstated. German soldiers who had endured 4 years of trench warfare, who had survived artillery bombardments and gas attacks and machine gun barrages, began to break. Discipline, which had been the hallmark of the German army, started to fray. Desertion increased. Mutiny, once unthinkable in the German military, began to occur. At home, the German population, already exhausted by 4 years of total war and the British naval blockade that had created severe food shortages, began to lose faith in ultimate victory. The German High Command faced a crisis of unprecedented proportions. Ludendorff, who had been the architect of Germany's military strategy, suffered a nervous breakdown in late September. He told the German Chancellor that Germany must seek an armistice immediately, that the military situation was hopeless. The generals who had promised victory had to confront the reality of defeat. The political consequences would be equally dramatic. Throughout September and into October, the pace of Allied advances accelerated. German forces retreated across terrain they had fought over and bled for throughout the war. Villages that had changed hands multiple times were abandoned by German forces who could no longer hold them against the coordinated assaults of the Allies. The railway-mounted guns that had been used to deliver devastating firepower against the Allies were captured or destroyed. The artillery pieces that had pulverized so many Allied attacks were now being hauled away by victorious soldiers as trophies of a war finally turning decisively. The casualty figures for the entire 100 Days offensive would eventually reach staggering proportions. British Empire forces, including troops from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, suffered over 350,000 casualties. French forces suffered over 190,000. American forces, concentrated primarily in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, suffered over 118,000. German casualties, including prisoners of war, numbered over 1 million. Yet despite these terrible costs, the Allies had finally broken the stalemate that had defined the Western Front. What remains remarkable is how little known this offensive has become in popular memory. The Battle of the Somme and Passchendaele, with their horrific casualty figures and minimal territorial gains, are remembered as symbols of the war's futility. Yet the 100 Days offensive, which achieved more in 95 days than previous campaigns had achieved in years, and which directly led to the end of the war, remains comparatively obscure. Perhaps this is because it represents the triumph of tactical innovation over futility, a narrative less dramatic than the trenches' grinding horror. Or perhaps it is because its success came so rapidly that it seemed almost inevitable in retrospect. The crisis had become the turning point. The German army, which had held the Western Front against seemingly impossible odds for 4 years, had been broken. The myth of German military superiority, which had sustained the war effort, and the German population's will to fight, had been shattered across the fields of France. The political consequences would follow swiftly. Within weeks, the German government would be forced to sue for peace. The armistice would be signed on the 11th of November, 1918. The Great War would end not with the negotiated stalemate that many had expected, but with the decisive victory of the Allies, made possible by the tactical innovations and coordinated warfare that defined the 100 Days offensive. The momentum that began at Amiens on the 8th of August accelerated with relentless purpose through the autumn of 1918. What started as a single breakthrough quickly transformed into a cascading series of offensives that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the entire war. The German army, which had seemed invincible for 4 years, found itself no longer fighting to win, but fighting merely to survive. The tactical innovations that had shattered the stalemate at Amiens, the coordinated tanks, the creeping artillery barrages, the aircraft providing reconnaissance and fire support, became the template for successive waves of Allied attacks that pushed German forces back across the devastated landscape of northern France and Belgium. In the days immediately following Amiens, British Commander Edmund Allenby recognized the critical opportunity before him. Rather than pause to consolidate gains, he pressed forward relentlessly. The Canadian Corps, which had spearheaded the initial assault, advanced nearly 8 miles in that first day alone, a distance that would have been considered miraculous in the static warfare of previous years. But the offensive did not stop there. On the 10th of August, fresh British divisions attacked further north near Albert, exploiting German weakness with methodical precision. The German High Command found itself unable to mount effective counterattacks. Their strategic reserves were depleted. Their soldiers, hungry and demoralized, lacked the fighting spirit that had sustained them through 4 years of attritional warfare. What historians would later call the Black Day of the German army occurred on that 8th of August, when German General Ludendorff reportedly told Kaiser Wilhelm that Germany had lost the war. The psychological blow was as devastating as the tactical defeat. For the first time, the German military establishment acknowledged internally what they had refused to admit publicly: victory was no longer possible. The illusion that had sustained German resistance through the terrible losses of the Spring Offensive of 1918, the Spring Offensive that had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives in a final desperate gamble for victory, shattered completely in the face of the coordinated Allied assault at Amiens. The subsequent weeks unfolded with grim inevitability. Between the 10th of August and the end of September, the Allies launched 4 major offensives along different sectors of the front. The Battle of Albert, from the 10th to the 22nd of August, saw British forces pushing forward against determined but weakening German resistance. The Battle of Bapaume, from the 24th of August through the 2nd of September, continued the pressure, with Australian and Canadian forces making significant territorial gains. Each offensive was coordinated with the French forces to the south, creating a strategic squeeze that the Germans could not adequately respond to. The sheer weight of Allied numbers, the quality of their new tactics, and the psychological momentum of success proved overwhelming. The most critical breakthrough came in late September, when Allied forces attacked the Hindenburg Line itself, that massive fortification system that had been the backbone of German defense for years. The St. Quentin Canal area, located at coordinates approximately 49 degrees, 51 minutes north, 3 degrees 25 minutes east, became the focal point of intense fighting. Here, British, Canadian, and South African forces attacked the German defenses with a coordination and ferocity born from months of learning and adaptation. The creeping barrage preceded the infantry assault, artillery guns advancing their fire patterns methodically across the landscape. Tanks supported the infantry, their guns suppressing German defensive positions. Aircraft provided reconnaissance, identifying German strong points and disrupting attempts to reinforce threatened sectors. The breakthrough at St. Quentin Canal on the 29th of September represented a psychological and strategic turning point. For the first time, the Hindenburg Line was breached. German defenders, who had held these fortifications through years of assault, were forced to retreat. The news reverberated through the German army and German society with shattering force. If the Hindenburg Line could be broken, what fortification remained? The mythology of German defensive strength, carefully cultivated and maintained through years of successful resistance, crumbled as surely as the concrete and barbed wire of the fortifications themselves. Contemporary accounts from German officers reveal the desperation of this period. One German regimental commander, writing in his diary on the 1st of October, described the situation in stark terms. "The men are exhausted. They have been fighting continuously for 3 months without relief. Ammunition is scarce. The enemy has overwhelming superiority in artillery, aircraft, and tanks. Retreat is the only option, but retreat to where? There is nowhere left to retreat to." This sentiment, repeated across German units from the North Sea coast to the Swiss border, captured the fundamental reality that had become undeniable: the German army was defeated. The political consequences followed swiftly. Germany's allies began to collapse. Bulgaria signed an armistice on the 30th of September. The Ottoman Empire, having fought a separate war against British and Allied forces in the Middle East and Mesopotamia, signed its own armistice on the 30th of October. Austria-Hungary, economically exhausted and facing the dissolution of its multinational empire as various nationalist groups demanded independence, agreed to an armistice on the 3rd of November. With Germany's allies gone and the Western Front collapsing, the German government faced an impossible choice: continue fighting a war that could no longer be won, or seek terms for peace. The internal political situation in Germany deteriorated as rapidly as the military situation. Strikes and protests erupted in German industrial cities. Workers' councils formed, demanding an end to the war. Sailors in the German fleet, ordered to make a final suicidal attack on the British Navy, mutinied instead. Soldiers returning from the front, traumatized and angry, began to organize politically. The German High Command, recognizing that the military situation was hopeless, pushed for an immediate armistice. On the 11th of November 1918, the guns fell silent. The armistice ending the First World War came into effect at 11 o'clock in the morning, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, a timing that would be remembered with particular poignancy in subsequent decades. Yet the significance of the 100 Days Offensive extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. The tactical innovations that had proven decisive at Amiens and sustained throughout the 95 days of continuous operations represented a fundamental transformation in warfare itself. The creeping barrage, that carefully choreographed advance of artillery fire that preceded infantry assaults, had evolved from a tactical device into a standard operational procedure. Tanks, which had first appeared on the Somme in 1916 in limited numbers, had become integrated into tactical planning as a regular component of offensive operations. Aircraft, initially used for reconnaissance, had become weapons platforms capable of strafing enemy positions and disrupting supply lines. The coordination of these different arms, infantry, artillery, armor, and air power, into a unified operational system represented something genuinely new in warfare. Military theorists and historians have long debated the nature of this transformation. Some scholars argue that the 100 Days Offensive represents the true birth of modern warfare, the moment when the static trench warfare of the previous 4 years gave way to more mobile, coordinated forms of combat. Others contend that it was primarily an evolution of existing tactical concepts, a refinement and improvement of methods that had been developing throughout the war. What remains uncontested is that the operational concepts developed during this period would influence military thinking for decades to come. The German blitzkrieg tactics of the 1930s and 40s would owe a conceptual debt to the combined arms operations of 1918. Soviet operational concepts would similarly be influenced by the lessons of this period. Even modern military doctrine, with its emphasis on coordinated operations across multiple domains, traces its intellectual lineage back to the innovations of the 100 Days Offensive. The human cost of these 95 days of continuous operations was staggering. Casualty figures remain debated among historians, partly because the chaos of rapid movement and changing front lines made precise accounting difficult. Conservative estimates suggest that the 100 Days Offensive resulted in approximately 1 million total casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing, across all combatants. The German army suffered approximately 350,000 casualties and lost approximately 190,000 prisoners. British and Commonwealth forces suffered approximately 240,000 casualties. French forces suffered approximately 30,000 casualties. American forces, still relatively new to the intensity of Western Front combat, suffered approximately 120,000 casualties. These numbers, staggering as they are, must be understood in context. They represent the cost of finally breaking the German army's resistance after 4 years of static warfare that had proven completely unable to achieve decisive results. Remarkably, given the magnitude of these events and their fundamental importance to ending the First World War, the 100 Days Offensive remains relatively unknown outside military history circles. The Battle of the Somme, fought in 1916, killed more soldiers but captured less ground and achieved less strategic result. Yet it remains far more familiar to the general public. The Battle of Verdun, the grinding attritional struggle between French and German forces in 1916, similarly remains more prominent in popular memory. Why should this be the case? Historians have proposed various explanations. Some suggest that the dramatic breakthrough operations of 1918, while militarily decisive, lacked the tragic mythic quality of earlier, more obviously futile battles. Others argue that the rapid collapse of Germany in 1918, while militarily satisfying, lacked the symbolic weight of earlier struggles. The Somme and Verdun have become cultural touchstones, representing the futility and horror of the First World War itself. The 100 Days Offensive, by contrast, represents its resolution, and perhaps the human mind prefers to dwell on the struggle rather than its conclusion. Archaeological investigations of the 100 Days Offensive battlefields have been conducted intermittently since the late 20th century, with increased activity beginning in the early 2000s. Teams from the University of Amiens and the Western Front Association have excavated trench systems, artillery positions, and recovered artifacts that reveal the material reality of these campaigns. More recent surveys using LiDAR technology and ground-penetrating radar have uncovered previously unknown trench networks and battlefield debris fields, deepening understanding of troop movements and tactical arrangements. These investigations have revealed the complexity of the battlefield, the layered defensive systems, the supply lines that sustained operations, the personal effects of soldiers who fought and died in these fields. Captured German artillery pieces, including an 11-inch railway-mounted gun, now displayed at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, stand as physical reminders of the scale of the military operations. The veterans who survived the 100 Days Offensive carried its lessons forward into the post-war period. Many became military theorists, writing memoirs and tactical analyses that shaped 20th century military thought. The lessons of combined arms warfare, of the importance of coordination between different military branches, of the necessity of maintaining momentum in offensive operations, these became foundational principles of modern military doctrine. Yet many veterans also carried psychological scars that the post-war world struggled to understand or address. What we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder was then called shell shock or battle fatigue, and its treatment remained primitive and often ineffective. The psychological cost of warfare, even when militarily successful, was substantial and long-lasting. The conclusion of the Hundred Days Offensive and the subsequent armistice also raised profound questions that would shape the 20th century. With Germany defeated and her allies collapsed, the question of what kind of peace would follow became paramount. The harsh terms imposed by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which many historians argue contributed to the rise of Nazi Germany and the Second World War, were in part a consequence of the decisiveness of the military victory achieved during these 95 days. Had the war continued to drag on, a negotiated peace might have been reached. But the complete military collapse of Germany in 1918 created the appearance of total victory, leading to demands for total victory in the peace settlement as well. The Hundred Days Offensive thus occupies a paradoxical place in history. Militarily, it was the most successful offensive campaign of the entire First World War, achieving breakthrough, maintaining momentum, and forcing decisive enemy collapse. Tactically, it represented the cutting edge of military innovation, integrating new technologies and operational concepts into a coordinated system of warfare. Yet, despite these achievements, it remains shadowed in popular memory by earlier, less successful campaigns. Perhaps this is fitting. The First World War was fundamentally a tragedy, and the tragic moments, the futile slaughter of the Somme, the grinding attrition of Verdun, have become its defining symbols. The moment when it finally ended, when the machinery of death was finally stopped, carries less emotional resonance than the moments when that machinery seemed unstoppable and inevitable. Yet for those who study military history, for those who seek to understand how warfare evolves and changes, the Hundred Days Offensive remains essential. It represents the moment when the old warfare of trenches and static lines gave way to something new. It demonstrates the importance of innovation, adaptation, and learning from experience. It shows how technological change, the development of tanks, aircraft, and improved artillery can be integrated into operational planning to achieve decisive results. And it reminds us that even in warfare, even in the terrible machinery of industrial combat, there can be moments of genuine achievement, when human ingenuity and courage overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The 95 days that changed everything remain, in their own way, a testament to the capacity of human beings to learn, adapt, and ultimately prevail, even in the most terrible circumstances imaginable. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through World War I history. These stories deserve to be remembered, and I'm grateful you're here to learn them with me. If this video resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me keep bringing these important stories to life. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of this period fascinates you most? What stories do you want to explore next? I've got plenty more incredible tales from the trenches and beyond coming your way very soon. So stay curious and keep learning. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.